Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for another episode talking about the commands of Christ. I have here in the studio with me Gabe Cleater, and we have been discussing over the last 3 episodes the command to follow me. This command can be found in Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, where Jesus says to Peter and Andrew, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." For this episode, we're going to be wrapping up this command, specifically focusing how that this command, the command to follow me and I will make you fishers of men, is really in many ways the key to experiencing the reality of who God is. And I think a lot of times when we talk about the reality of who God is, it's really different. We come to find it's really different than what we would expect. And we're going to talk about some of those differences. And one of those differences is many times in following God, He will lead us through suffering. He'll lead us through trials. But there's a purpose in these trials. There's a purpose in these sufferings that we will go through, and it's to conform us to the image of Jesus Christ. And that's really the heart behind this command. So I'm excited to talk about these things today. One of the first things I want to highlight as we start into this episode is how who we follow we become. And I know we've touched on this in the previous episodes, but this is very significant because I feel like the command of Christ to follow me is Jesus giving us an invitation of, if you want to become like me, you have to follow me. And we've talked about how whether it's social media or other people, how who we follow, that person that we're following has a great influence upon us. We've also talked about how we not only follow other people, but other people follow us and we influence other people. And so this is very, very significant as we consider the command of Christ to follow me. And I think Jesus gives a very powerful passage that ties really well into the command, follow me. And really, in essence, he says in this passage, and I'm about ready to read it, but let me say this before I read it, is that really he's saying you can only follow one person. And that's very powerful because I think in my mind, a lot of times I may want to follow the Lord, but I also have other interests. I have other passions. I have other thoughts. There's other things that pull for my attention. But really with the command, follow me, there's only one person we can follow, and that's Jesus. And this passage that I'm talking about is found in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 22, and we're going to read through 22 through 24. And just listen and kind of put this passage in context with the command, follow me. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 22, he says, "The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. But if thine eye be evil," and that word evil actually means multiple focus. "But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness?" And then verse 24 is where I really want to focus, where Jesus, he only gives one option. He says this, "No man can serve 2 masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon." And I think that is so important. What Jesus is saying here is we're either following one of 2 things. Either we're following Jesus Christ and He is Lord of our life, or else we are following the world. And either person we're following, both have consequences. One has a consequence. Following Jesus has a consequence of getting to know Him and causing his life to become a part of our life. Following the world, the consequence of that and the byproduct is honestly, in the end, is following the ways of death. There isn't an eternal investment in that. But if we follow Christ, not only do we make an eternal investment, but we also have, God gives us the ability to see the world and the people in it and the things of the world in the right perspective. Gabe, you have kind of a story along the lines of how sometimes following in certain footsteps doesn't always lead us to the place we expect it to. Do you want to share that with our listeners?
Sure, and I think what you were saying was good, Nate. You were giving us the contrast of we're always following someone or something, and so the question is who or what are we following? And we can't follow two things at the same time, right?
Can't.
So you can't, it says no man can serve two masters, right? You'll either follow one or you'll follow the other. There's no on the fence in Christianity, right? The devil owns the fence. So
that's right.
If I'm not following the Lord wholeheartedly, I am following the enemy. And so I think it's important to see even where in Proverbs it says there's a way that seems right to a man, but it ends in death. So the Lord wants us to not just take the way that seems right to us, but rather take the way of following Him.
That's right.
And I feel like it's like the way of the world promises life and happiness and all these things, but it ends in death. Mm-hmm. Whereas God's way, from the very beginning, when Jesus said, follow me, He said, take up the cross. It starts in death, but it ends in life.
That's right.
And so these are the two choices that we always have. But I think when we look at following Jesus, a story that came to my mind was, so I really enjoy visiting national parks, and earlier this year I went with some friends to visit Rocky Mountain National Park. Now, I'd been there before, but this time we were coming in the winter. Well, it wasn't in the winter, but the mountains, it was in April, but the mountains still had a lot of snow up on top. And you're talking like 4 feet of snow on the ground, 4 or 5 feet of snow, a lot of snow on the ground in the mountains. And we were going to do this hike. It was going to probably be about an 8-mile round trip hike. There was supposedly beautiful views and vistas from the top of this place that we were going to hike to, mostly uphill, mostly going up the mountain. And we had to get these, because there was snow, it was ice, the trails would be slippery. We put like these spikes on our shoes. It was like it was almost like putting cleats on the bottom of your shoe. They had like rubber on the top and metal spikes on the bottom. You'd put it around the bottom of your shoe so that you would have traction, because when you're trying to go up and it's icy, it's really slippery. So even a small incline would actually be pretty difficult to climb. And so we put these metal cleats on our shoes, and we started making our way up the trail there, and you couldn't see the trail at all. It was completely covered in snow. Mm-hmm. But for the first part of the trail, a lot of people had walked it before, and so it was very easy to follow where we were supposed to go. Even the trail signs were covered in snow. You couldn't see any of that, but you could see clearly where other people had gone, and so we kind of just started following other people's tracks. We got to the place, the first stop, which was like where there was like this lake that was all frozen over and these 2 rock points. It was very pretty. And then we were going to keep going, though, because we were going to hike further. Well, most people stop, or a lot of the people, I think, stop at that hike and don't go further. So the trail wasn't as clear, and we keep going, we passed some other people coming down, and they were like, oh, we were trying to find our way to the top, and we couldn't find it, and we were like, we kind of just smiled, we're like, yeah, but we know what we're doing, or so we thought.
Oh, boy.
So we're going, and we were like, okay, we got to a place we didn't know where to go, where you were supposed to go, and we thought, well, we found some tracks in the snow, and that's all. And we thought, well, we'll follow this person's tracks, because they probably were going up to the top, and so if we follow their tracks, we should end up at the top, right? So we start following in their tracks, and we're going along and thinking we're going up to the top. We thought we were going the right way. We thought we were following this person who we assumed knew where they were going. Well, all of a sudden, we get to the edge of the spot, and the tracks just stop. And apparently, the person realized that they were going the wrong way and turned around and went back.
Wow.
But of course, we were led to nowhere because we were following, but we weren't following someone who knew where they were going.
Wow.
And so finally, we ended up turning back, and now it was getting late. The sun was going down. It's cold. We were like, we got to find our way back. And now we start trying to retrace our steps, and we couldn't remember. We missed the turnoff to follow the trail back because it was so confusing, and we probably followed other tracks. And we were like, it was starting to get a little scary because the sun was going down. It was getting dark, and we're trying to find our way back. But praise the Lord, we were able to. I had a GPS thing on my phone, and we were able to find where we had turned off, get back on the trail, and we made it back to the car.
Wow.
Right at about as it was getting dark. But I share all that to say we followed in someone else's footsteps, but the person didn't know where they were going, obviously. And I think sometimes what can happen is we as believers can tend to, as Christians, we tend to naturally follow a person. We tend to we tend to follow men, we tend to follow methods, and we tend to follow ministries. Like, that's the direction that we tend to naturally follow what we can see.
Right.
And the problem with that, obviously, certainly God uses men, he uses ministries, and he uses methods to encourage us in our relationship with him. But if we get our focus just on man and following man, the danger is that we will end up following the man instead of following Christ.
Wow.
And when that man fails or falls, as men tend to do, is we end up disillusioned and shaken up.
That's right.
And even as we've known in the last number of years, different Christian leaders falling, if our focus was on that person, it can really shake us. Wow. It's kind of like we were following them instead of following Christ. And so when they fail, it can be a real shaking. But what I think it should cause us to do is to look up and make sure that we're actually following Christ.
That's right.
God can use other people to point us, to the Lord. God uses different leaders and different ones to point us to the Lord, and that's important. But we need to make sure that we're always following Christ, that we're following in his footsteps, that we're seeking him, that we're following him, and not just following people, but we're following Jesus.
That's right. And Gabe, as you're sharing that story that you shared, it could have been fatal. I mean, if something would have gone wrong in you following those footsteps, who knows what could have happened to you guys. And I think a lot of times we get so focused on a person that we just don't, or a thing that we're following, we don't at least I know I don't tend to pick up my head and look ahead and say, where is this leading me? And I think for our listeners, because following other people's not a bad thing, especially if, there's somebody that is making a spiritual investment in your life, meaning they're encouraging you to follow Jesus.
Right. Paul even said, follow me as I follow Christ.
That's right. And I think one of the things, so, for the sake of our listeners, and this has been helpful for me, is, well, how do you know, like, obviously the number one person to follow is Jesus. But then with other people, how do you know if somebody's life that you want to follow, or you want to get counsel from, or you want to get guidance from, how do you know if they're really following the Lord? And how do you know if they're going to point you in that direction when you follow their leading? Well, a real simple tool that has helped me is just look at the fruit of their life. Look at their actions. Look at what they do. Get to know them. And very quickly, you'll find who they are. And because, if we're following someone, I think especially in social media groups where we tend to build these ideas of people who we've not really met, but we like, look at the fruit of their life. Is that what you want to be in 5 years from now? Is that what you want to be in 10 years from now? I've heard of different artists where even working in the secular realm with different people, and they rant and rave about certain artists, and you start studying about the life of these people, and it's just like, oh my, I wouldn't want my life to be like them at all. Not because I'm judging them, but because their choices led to negative consequences that in many situations are irreparable. And so following Christ, we know that he will not lead us astray. We know that's an anchor. We know he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right?
Right.
And so what a promise that we have. If we follow Christ, we're going in the right direction. And another element to this command is follow me and I will make you fishers of men. I think it's important that just like you, Gabe, followed those tracks in the snow and that led you to a wrong place, I think as we follow the Lord, keeping in mind that we do want other people, we do want to be an influence, a positive influence on other people. It's just like we are influenced by others, but we're also an influence on others, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Right, it does, because like basically what you're saying is that we're all following and we're all leading.
Yeah, which is so powerful.
Right.
And which begs the thought, well, what is my life communicating to other people?
Right.
And that's heavy.
Right.
There are certain things. I remember what one person said, and this really weighs heavy on me as a father, as a parent. They said this. They said, what you as a parent do in moderation, your children will do in excess. And there are certain things as a parent, and even before becoming a parent, that I chose not to do that was kind of, maybe some people would say on the line, but I chose not to do it because I thought, okay, so what's the next step after that?
Right.
I was like, oh, no, that's too close.
Right.
I don't want to go there. The end is not what I want. And the idea of following Christ, we know what that end is. It's getting to know him, but it's also leading others to him.
Right.
And so I think for each one of our listeners, I want to encourage you, your life is influencing someone. And that's a privilege. That's an honor, especially if you are following the Lord. Because really, as one person said, best leaders are basically followers.
Right.
And that's not just something like, oh, well, I followed enough, now I'm a leader, so I don't have to keep following. Following Jesus is an everyday experience. And I know the temptation as I grow deeper in my walk with the Lord might become the idea of like, well, I've got it made, I've got it together, I kind of know how this works, and quit following. But yet, I know as I've had ministry opportunities, I've had different leadership opportunities in ministries, that's a dangerous spot because you can continue to preaching, you can continue sharing, but if you're not constantly building that intimate relationship with the Lord, you will fall one day. I will fall one day.
That's so true, and I think it's like that's why we need to continuously be following the Lord. We never outgrow following the Lord. We always need to follow Him with all our heart, and that as we follow, then keeping our eyes fixed on Him and never looking back.
That's right.
Like Jesus, even he was talking about in Luke chapter 9, verse 61. There's different ones that were talking about actually following Jesus. And I'm not going to read all the verses here. I'm just going to read the last two here because it's very interesting. Jesus said in Luke chapter 9, verse 61, and another also said, Lord, I will follow thee, but let me first go bid them farewell which are at my house. And Jesus said unto them, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. And that's very strong,
very
right?
Much
but he's
so.
like saying basically is that to follow the Lord is to not look back. And it's like in another place in Luke, it directly tells us, remember Lot's wife? And I think Lot's wife is a picture, if you remember the story when Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed and judged by God and destroyed by fire and brimstone, Lot and his wife were delivered and were being taken out, but they were told not to look back. But then, for whatever reason, maybe because her heart was still there, Lot's wife turned back, and when she did, she was turned to a pillar of salt.
Wow.
And it's like when we look back, we become unfruitful in our work for the Lord. And so I think it's just so important to see that it's like when we set our hand to it says, no man that sets his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom. And so it's like that and so just that we would keep our gaze fixed on the Lord.
That's right.
That we'd follow Him with all our heart without ever looking back.
That's right.
I was very stirred by a story that I heard about the history of a hymn that I think illustrates this really, really well. And some of our listeners might be familiar with this hymn, but the hymn is, I have decided to follow Jesus, which fits so well with our command,
yes, follow me.
But it's an amazing story of how this hymn ended up coming about, and I think it really illustrates following. Because I think sometimes when we follow Jesus, because we're familiar with the term, following on Facebook and following these different things, but following Jesus is way deeper than following someone on Facebook or on Instagram,
well,
right?
It's a life change. I mean, it's a commitment. You're all in,
right?
Whereas on Facebook or Twitter, or you have distance, right? I mean, you can kind of follow them, but you can also kind of live your own life, right?
Right. So this is right. Whereas following Jesus isn't that way. It's an all-in, 100%,
it's an identity change,
fully committed life. That's right. And so it's like the person where the hymn came out of, the story that the hymn "I Have Decided to Follow Jesus" came out of, actually came out of India, and there was a man that and his family, and actually as a result of the Welsh revivals, there were different ones that traveled over to India and really began to share the Lord in these different places. And there was this one headhunting tribe that the missionaries went to and began to share Jesus with, and there was a man and his family that ended up giving their life to Jesus, and I think began to influence the tribe for the Lord. Well, the chief got very angry at what was happening, and he brought the family out, and he basically told the man because the man said, "I have decided to follow Jesus," right? And he told the man, "Well, if you don't basically reject the Lord, I'll have I'll have your 2 children killed." And he had 2 boys, and he said, I talked about, "I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back."
Wow.
And so they killed his 2 sons. And then they basically asked him again, I think, if he would renounce the Lord. And he said, and they said, basically, "If you don't, we'll kill your wife." And then he said, "I have decided to follow Jesus, no, though none go with me,
wow,
still I will follow."
That's amazing.
So they killed his wife.
Oh.
And then they said, then they basically, I told him again, basically, if you don't renounce your faith or whatever, we'll kill you. And he said, "The world behind me, the cross before me, I have decided to follow Jesus." And they killed him. Okay, so this is the kind of follow me. That's heavy and strong, but it's like, this is the kind of follow that we're talking about, where they were committed even to death. But the result of that, the chief saw when the chief saw, who we call him again, when he saw their boldness to stand for the Lord, even to the point of death, he was so deeply moved that he looked out and he said, "I'm following Jesus now too."
Wow.
And he gave his life to Jesus.
Praise
and as
the
a result
Lord.
of that, many in the tribe gave their life to Jesus too. And
Wow.
God did a tremendous, tremendous work there. But that was so impactful to me.
Yes.
Is like that this is what God is calling us to. And the call to follow Jesus oftentimes is a call that means walking through suffering.
That's right.
It says in 1 Peter 2:21, "For even whereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps." And so in following Jesus, we're following the Lamb that was slain. We're following the one that went through the suffering and death of the cross, and then, of course, the resurrection. And so it's not surprising that walking and following Jesus often means suffering.
It does.
And it even says in Revelation 14:4, "These are they which have not defiled with women, they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and unto the Lamb." And so it says, these are those that follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. And that's like God's calling us, is to follow him, the Lamb that was slain and is now risen, right? Wherever he goes, even when it means walking through suffering and difficulty. And I think is a vivid picture, and I know we need to wrap up here for the sake of time, but I think a vivid picture of this is in the life of Peter. And the picture, we started this whole podcast out talking about the call on Peter and Andrew's life to follow Jesus and how God's calling us to that as well. Well, it's amazing. You see that Jesus called Peter, and he began to follow the Lord. And it's interesting because when Jesus called him to follow, it was like he began to follow the Lord, but then they got to the point where it was coming up to the cross, and Peter, listen to what it says in John 13:36. "Simon Peter said unto him, Lord, whither goest thou? Jesus answered him, Whither I go," he was going to the cross. He said, "Whither I go, thou canst not follow me now, but thou shalt follow me afterwards." And it's so interesting because remember then Jesus told, either before or after that, Jesus told Peter that he was going to actually, I believe it was right after that he was going to deny Christ, right? And so it's like he was following the Lord to a certain degree, but it's like he wasn't ready yet to lay down his life for the Lord. And so we know that he did end up denying Christ 3 times, and then Jesus died, he rose again, right? And then he meets with Peter again, actually. So it's interesting because what did Peter go back to when he went back to fishing. He even said, I go fishing, right?
He did, actually.
And so after this, he goes back to fishing. Remember, this is almost like his old identity, where it's like he goes back to that. And we don't know if he fished in between as well, but it's like he went back to the fishing, and he's there fishing, and he they end up catching these fish, and they see Jesus on the shore, right? And so they come to the shore, and they have all these fish, a huge amount of fish that they pull up on the net, and they have all the fish there. And then he has this encounter with Jesus, and it's like Jesus looks at him and says, lovest thou me more than these? Now, some maybe would think, well, he was talking about, do you love me? When he asked that question of Peter, do you love me more than these? That he was asking him, do you love me more than these disciples? And that could be, but I wonder if he was pointing actually to all the fish that Peter had just caught, Peter's identity, his career, his livelihood.
Wow.
He said, do you love me more than these?
Wow.
Right? And Peter says, yes. And he says, okay, feed my sheep, which we'll talk about later in another command. And then he asks him again, and he asks him again. And finally, in the third time he asks him, he says, he saith unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he said him the third time, lovest thou me? And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. Jesus saith unto him, feed my sheep. And then Jesus says this to Peter, verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. This spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, follow me.
Wow.
And I think that's so powerful, because before the cross, it's like he says, he tells him, you can't follow me, but you'll follow me later, right? And it's like after the resurrection, and then later when Jesus ascended and poured the Spirit on Peter, it's like he was going to follow him then, follow him all the way to death. I believe Peter was crucified even upside down, because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified the same way his Lord was. So I believe it was Peter who asked to be crucified upside down. He followed him. Right? Even unto death and unto suffering. And it was like, then you see after this, on the day of Pentecost and the Spirit was poured out, Peter preaching with boldness and courage in speaking of the Lord. And you know what Peter became as he followed the Lord? A fisher of men.
Praise the Lord.
Just like the Lord said, nigh even to death. This is what God's call of our lives is, to follow him. And it's not going to be a path of all flowers and roses and things, but it is the true life to follow Jesus, even through suffering, even through death, because of his call over our lives.
Praise God. That is so encouraging. And those stories are so encouraging. You know, it reminds me of Revelation, I believe is 12:10. And they overcame him, it says, by the word, by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and that they basically didn't love their lives even to death. And you know, I think for our listeners, this is kind of a heavy, kind of grave subject, but yet I want to encourage you, because, you know, while not all of us maybe, or more than likely probably won't be martyrs for Christ, but where this true death starts is death to our identity, death to what we think are our thoughts, death to our ideas, death to our career path, or whatever it is that we hold more significant than our relationship with the Lord, than following God, than doing his will. I hope our listeners have been encouraged with this podcast. Our prayer, our desire is that each one of you guys grow and go deeper in your walk with the Lord. If this has encouraged you, please subscribe. That way you don't miss any further episodes, but also share it. And remember, you're a follower of Jesus if you are a believer in Jesus, but others are following you. God bless you guys, and we look forward to joining you our next episode.